Okay, I think we are ready to start. It's 1:05, and I'm just going to start introducing White Ribbon and myself, and hopefully more folks will join us today. I just want to first check if sound and video are working okay. If you can see the slides I am sharing with you right now. Okay, awesome. So folks, welcome. My name is David Garzon. I am the Community Engagement Manager for White Ribbon. If at any point we have some issues with sound or with the visuals, please let me know. I'll try to fix them. As I was sharing with some folks before, this is really my first time doing a webinar like this from the comfort of my home. So, and also managing this particular software. So let me know if at some point something stops working. I'll make sure to fix it. For today, we had about 20 participants registering for this webinar. I know some folks did it to receive the video afterwards of the event, but I am wondering who is here. I know we had some mixed participation from students, staff, faculty, and I'm wondering if we have folks from those three groups, or if folks are joining mostly from sexual violence prevention offices. And I'm also wondering which schools are joining us right now. So if you feel comfortable and want to share where you're joining us from, and if you're a student, faculty, and maybe what brought you here, that would be great. This is to give me an understanding of who is here, and if I'm speaking about sexual violence prevention and healthy masculinities, to folks who are doing this kind of work in institutions or to students. Okay, great. So we have Sheridan, student rights, awesome, great. Yeah, I noticed a lot of folks from Sheridan College were going to join us, and thanks a lot to those of you who shared the poster for the event. UOIT, awesome. Great. Okay, I'm getting a private message here. Okay. I have also some students. Okay. Awesome. So I think I guessed right when preparing this presentation, and thinking that this would be mostly targeted to folks working on sexual violence prevention in their own campuses. So this is great. If at any point you have any questions throughout the presentation, please let me know. I know there are some resources available, like you can raise your hand if you have questions. If not, just feel free to write it on the chat above. Below, sorry, and I can just keep an eye on that throughout the presentation. So, as I said, my name is David Garzon. I would like to start by, of course, acknowledging that although we're doing this webinar online, each one of our institutions is located at a place where indigenous folks had established their own societies. So I would like to start with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that our organizations are located there, and also acknowledging that as White Ribbon, we are fully compromised and express full solidarity in finding justice and truth for indigenous women and girls who have gone missing throughout Canada. I would also like to let you know that we are going to be talking about sexual violence. Some topics in this presentation might be triggering. So please, we encourage always self-care. If you need to put me on mute, if you need to leave, if you need to just take a break, please feel free to do so. I won't take it personally. We completely understand that it's a hard topic, and I have some resources here from across Ontario you might be familiar with. We just put them there because we want you to know that we care about your well-being. We want you to know, and especially this applies a lot when we're working with the students. We want you to know that there are resources out there, and that if you or anyone you know are going through situations of violence, there is help out there, and you can access it. Something else, this webinar is brought to you in as part of the Jawline Campaign, which is a campaign that was started by the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers and Action Ontarien, two organizations working in the front lines on sexual violence prevention and response. And after a while of this campaign being created, some organizations like White Ribbon joined to address different issues or layers related to sexual violence prevention and response. White Ribbon works on the topic of male engagement in gender-based violence prevention and sexual violence prevention. And we've been working with this project for about, I think, 4 years. And I've been managing this project for the last year. We're about to close by the end of this week the Jawline project, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to finish all of our activities with this webinar. I think I already mentioned this. And then for today, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about White Ribbon, our work, what we do and how we do it. Also a little bit about our history. Then I'm going to be trying out for the first time doing an activity online that we usually do on our live workshops. It's called the Man Box. You might be familiar with it. It's gonna allow us to talk about masculinity, define what expectations exist on masculinity, and perhaps find the root causes of gender-based violence and sexual violence from a perspective in which we inquire about social norms, right, and expectations. Then we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about sexual violence, and then the things that we can do from our organizations and as sexual violence prevention offices, administrations, and so on, to prevent violence and to encourage male allyship within our campus. So I am going to start by telling you a little bit about White Ribbon. Many of you might have heard of our organization. We were created as a response to the Montreal massacre, which happened in 1989. Basically, in 1991, when we were about to have the first day of remembrance, folks realized that there was an overwhelming participation of women, queer folks, in preparing for that day, in organizing for that day, but there was also an overwhelming lack of male voices participating in the conversation, right? After the Montreal massacre had occurred, Canadian society was just basically wondering what had gone wrong. How did we end up in a place like this, in which such a terrible act was committed? So after realizing that men were not being part of this conversation, a group of men in Toronto decided to create the White Ribbon Campaign with the sole purpose of engaging men and boys in conversations about gender-based violence prevention and masculinities. Something I've been talking a lot since I started my work with White Ribbon is the incidents from the picture on the right, the Toronto van attacks. You probably heard of these events, and the reason why I've been talking about what happened almost a year ago, which was on April of 2018, was because these two events, which are considered to be the two largest mass massacres in Canadian history, are or were committed based on the same motivations. The Montreal massacre, as you know, was perpetrated by a male who was upset because women were taking too many spaces in engineering programs. So he decided to show up at a college in Montreal and shoot women, particularly as an act of revenge. He was openly attacking them for being feminists or being influenced by feminist ideas, say like that. And then the Toronto van attacks were a result of what we now know as the incel community, which is an online community of male identified folks mostly, who just think they cannot date. The society is not structured in a way in which they can date, they can create meaningful relationships with others, romantic or sexual, and therefore they often seek to perpetuate harm, mostly towards women, sometimes towards men who are dating. And it's an entire community which the CBC just recently estimated has around 60,000 members online, who organize online, and who are spread mostly in the West, right? So, which is something that we're just starting to understand, but it's something to keep in mind, because although these two events were 30 years apart from each other, like it seems like those motivations are still pretty alive in our communities, and it's something that we have to address if we want to address gender-based violence. So something that I've noticed in doing this work here in Canada, I've previously worked in Bolivia, in Guatemala, and Colombia, doing very similar kind of work on gender-based violence prevention and gender equity. Is that in Canada we like thinking that violence is not happening in our communities. Often, if you were to mention to someone that you work on gender-based violence prevention for an NGO, they would ask you, where are you located, or where do you work? What, right? Which country, right? Because we think as Canadians that violence is not happening here. We think that violence is happening somewhere else. And I often share a story about me one time being in Kenya for a white ribbon assignment, in which I was staying at a hostel, and a couple of Canadians, a Canadian couple in their 60s came in to the room where we were having breakfast, and they asked me what I was doing in Kenya, right? I was clearly just traveling there. And I told them that I was doing some violence prevention work with some refugee communities, right? And they also asked me where I was from. I told them that I was Colombian because I was originally born in Colombia. And the response from the lady was, well, you must know a lot about violence since you're Colombian, right? It was a comment based on a stereotype. I don't know, like I feel like stereotypes often lead to that kind of comments, right? But my response was, well, you know what? I'm just here for 2 weeks, and I live in Toronto. I am also Canadian, and I do gender-based violence prevention work there, right? And her expression completely changed. She said, I'm sorry. And she said, look, this is my second husband, and I had to leave my first husband because he used to be physically abusive towards me. And I tell this story because it was very interesting to me how this person was splitting violence in two different categories. She was thinking of the violence that happens somewhere else and which she put a lot more attention to, and then the violence that happens in Canada, which she had maybe gone through, and then was not acknowledging in the same way. So I think that as Canadians, our work is to acknowledge that violence that is happening, and making sure that we know that is free alive in our communities, and although it might not be as spoken about or part of our conversations that often, is still there. So we know that once every 6 days a woman is killed by her current or previous boyfriend. We know that half of all Canadian women have experienced some form of gender-based violence. We know that each given night, 3,500 women are going to sleep in shelters. Many times they are going to be escaping situations of violence. Many times they will be escaping with their kids. And many times shelters are not going to have enough capacity for all of them, and they're not going to be able to take them in, right? It's a reality that it's happening. And something that I've noticed, I've been doing this presentation for almost a year with the students, mostly many times high school students, is that folks are very surprised. They never imagined this was happening there, like here in Canada. So our entire programming, White Ribbons programming, is based on a couple ideas. We know that, or we understand gender-based violence as a response. As a result of gender norms. And gender expectations. And we understand that these norms and expectations create some unbalance or hierarchy between genders that allow some genders to perpetrate violence over other genders, right? We know that in most cases of violence, perpetrators tend to be men and boys. And we also know that in most cases of violence, women and the LGBTQ plus community tend to be the victims, right? Now, we're also based on the fact that although most violence is coming from men, most men are not violent, which is something really important, because we believe that we should leverage on that fact in order to get men to participate and stand up against sexism. So we have honest and open conversations with men and boys about gender-based violence, about how masculinity is constructed in our culture, how we value anger, a particular kind of strength, and so on in our communities, and how we could challenge those very norms that give some space or allow violence to happen, enable violence to happen. Now, as I said, there are really good news in regards to men's understanding and positioning on gender-based violence, right? In 2012, we did a survey over the phone. We called, I think it was around 1,000 men located in Ontario, and we asked them about gender-based violence. We asked them what they thought about gender equity and so on and so forth, and the responses were really good. So as you see in this slide, we know that 97% of men in Ontario think that gender equity makes sense, that it's a goal we have to reach to. But we also found through this survey that although a lot of men do agree that gender equity is a necessity, a lot of men are not doing anything in their everyday lives to end sexism, right? And that's the gap, that's the challenge, that's the gap that we have to close. And it's what we try to do with our work. Now, a couple more things. Why is it important for us to work with men? Men are often unaware of how violence is happening in our communities. Many times, working with guys, we would see attitudes in which guys are just like, you know what, I'm not violent, therefore it is not my problem. I don't want to learn about this. I'm doing my work, so you go and talk to the bad guys out there, right? We also know that peer culture is very important in addressing gender-based violence prevention, because men learn from men. Men are constantly copying each other's behaviors, and even if somebody just makes, let's say, a sexist comment, that might be enabling violence coming from somebody else, one of their peers, right? So that's another reason why we want to work with men. And lastly, because we know that we can do a lot better in educating folks out there in what consent means, what a healthy relationship means, and what exactly can male identified folks do when facing situations of sexism. So I am going to pass on to do an activity. As I said, this is my very first time doing this activity online, but we're gonna give it a try. I didn't want to just be the only one talking or doing yeah, all the lecturing. And so this activity we call the man box. It's very simple, and it's at the core of work with masculinities. A lot of organizations use it, and it's really the activity that we usually use to start our workshops to get men talking about gender expectations. So right here you see two boxes, one blue box inside of the pink box, right? And we would usually do this on a flip chart. We would ask folks to do that first square, the blue square, and we would ask them to list all the things that men have to do, all the characteristics that men have to fulfill in order to be considered a real man. These characteristics can be physical, in character, in personality type, but these cannot be things that we also ask of women. Just things, characteristics that we ask of men. So I encourage you folks to maybe help us with this. What are some of those characteristics that we expect from men, and only from men? And feel free to write them on the chat box. There might be a way in which you can also like turn on your microphone and can figure this out. Thanks, Veronique. Being the breadwinner, right? Having money. We often tell men that their value comes from making that money and having a lot, because otherwise they're not going to be appreciated in our society. Anything else? Anyone? Okay. Have someone type in there. Awesome. Okay. A strength. Physical and emotional. Okay, so we're all familiar with that expectation on a strength, physical strength. We expect men to be big, muscular. I often cite the WWE or the WWF, which I grew up watching, as those stereotypes that we get from media as of what it means to be strong physically. Now, when talking about emotions, we just got something very interesting here, because a comment is saying emotional strength, while other comments are saying unemotional. So what does it mean to be emotionally strong for a guy? Okay, not really. Tough, independent, rational, unemotional. Tough, sucking it up, not crying. So emotional strength for men means not showing emotion? Or is there one emotion that you might think of that is a lot more common to see men engage with? There you go, anger. That's where I was getting to, right? So thanks a lot, Sherry. Anger is the emotion that we expect men to show. Other emotions mean being weak. Showing other emotions means for a man that you are weak, right? So just to give you an example of what we usually get, is this set of characteristics. As you mentioned, being the breadwinner, being the provider, being strong in the ways that we spoke about, being aggressive, being in control or dominant, right? You're expected to lead, you're expected to dominate your relationships, emotionless, not crying, fearless, successful, and being the player. It's also a big one. Sometimes it does come up with high school students, right? You demonstrate your value to other men by showing how many, if you're heterosexual, by showing how many women you can be engaged with in a romantic or sexual relationship, right? Outside of the box, we ask folks to list things that they are going to be called if they don't follow those mandates inside of the box. And this is what we usually get. And we do this activity to get folks talking about how masculinity is regulated, right? We often think of ourselves as being free agents, as being the owners of our own masculinity, and having complete agency over ourselves. But this gets guys thinking about like the expectations and the scripts that they're following in their everyday lives, and maybe question also like which ones are good, which ones are bad, right? This has led to really good conversations about being strong, right? When I am with a group of students and I ask them about their moms, if their moms are strong or not, everyone is going to say my mom is probably the strongest human being I know, right? And then I ask them, well, what's the difference between that strength and this strength that we just have listed here, right? Which is an important difference, I'm sorry, but one that we're not speaking about enough. So we're often talking about these things, and I bring up these questions that I will share with you, which are, what do you think keeps people in these gender norms or in these gender boxes? That is, why do we stay there? Social acceptance, right? It's not uncommon to receive a response that is like, well, how am I supposed to be liked? How am I supposed to be respected? Right? Peer pressure. Yeah, all of our peers are expecting us to be masculine in a certain way and demonstrate our masculinity over and over again. And we speak out gender being performative. We speak out it as something that we never end showing. It's always that we always have to be presenting, because otherwise you become the opposite of what you're trying to present or what you were previously trying to present. Lack of positive models. That's right. Sometimes, and I share this story often, and which is related to the fourth question here about intersectionality. When I came to Canada, it was really hard for me to adapt to a little town where I arrived called Welland in South Ontario, close to Niagara Falls, precisely because I didn't know English. There were some Latino men, some Latino students in the high school I was in, but their entire masculinity was based on the Latino men that they had seen on the media, Scarface, and all of these movies about that construct Latino masculinity in a certain way that is often associated with hyper masculinity and illegal activities and so on, right? And it was the lack of a positive role model that I understand now had led them there, right? Gender policing, risk of violence for gender nonconformity. Yeah, sometimes you are just following those mandates because you know that somebody's going to be aggressive, or like physically or verbally violent against you if you don't do them right. There's also that aspect of fear. And I think we just covered like the 4 questions here. Maybe I already shared my experience, but do you have any other examples of how identities, multiple identities based on race, um, sexual orientation, anything could intersect this box on masculinity? I remember once also in a workshop with teachers, somebody mentioning folks who are disabled and who are often desexualized and therefore seen as less of a man if they're guys, right? Because of that process of being desexualized, right? Um, and something that I think didn't come up here about what keeps us in gender boxes, which is often the number one response from students, is media. Folks are pretty aware that they're getting a lot of pressure from media, that is social media and then music, um, film, TV shows, and so on, about how you're supposed to be as a man. I just recently discovered, for example, an artist called Little Pump, and I was amazed first by how popular this artist is, and also by the lyrics, which I think could lead to many misunderstandings of what it means to be a man in our society. I'm just gonna leave it there in case you don't know who I'm talking about. And I think that artist is something that I'll be exploring in my next workshops because I think it's appealing a lot to young people. Now, why is it important to discuss the Mambox? There's an organization called Promundo does the same kind of work that White Ribbon does, but in the States, and they do a lot of research surrounding this Mambox. We know that folks who truly follow these mandates are more likely to perpetrate bullying, and are also more likely to perpetrate sexual harassment, right? This might not be a surprise since we know that those expectations are pretty sexist in of themselves. What does this what do these expectations have on what do these negative I'm sorry, what do these what negative repercussions do these expectations have on women, trans, non-binary, and queer folk? We know, of course, discrimination is pretty alive in our communities against trans folks. Homophobia, sexism are pretty alive in our communities. Violence could be physical, verbal, sometimes just online, which is a new phenomenon that is happening a lot. And we've had talks with teachers in which they express their concerns about what's happening online, because none of us, including myself, grew up with a smartphone in our pocket that we could be accessing anytime, and in which we could just be leaving any comments with no repercussions whatsoever, right? And sometimes emotional labor, sometimes the emotions that are not being addressed by men tend to have to be addressed by their partners or their families, and sometimes they're very strong on them, because then men tend to just look for maybe one source to express their feelings, and it's a lot once you have accumulated so much over the course of years, a decade, and so on. One time I was having this workshop with grade 7 students, and a kid, he must have been like 13 years old, who was very mature for his age, because I don't think at that age I would have shared something like that. I just didn't have the language or the understanding of these issues. He shared that he lived with his parents, but that his father was there, but he really was not there. So I asked him what he meant, and he said, well, my father lives with us, with my mom and myself, but he doesn't talk to us. He just doesn't communicate anything, just like the basics, right? And I think that many of us might be familiar with that setting. I remember just growing up and just always seeing my uncles, who were fantastic human beings, just like being very quiet and just like using their time to watch soccer and reading the newspaper, but never really communicating their feelings, right? Which I came to understand also later, that it's something that they were repressing a lot, and they were facing difficult situations, but they just didn't have the language to share those emotions. And something that we bring up in our workshops is, well, these expectations have also really negative impacts on men themselves, right? Loneliness is a huge issue in North America, particularly. It's been said that is the biggest threat facing middle-aged men, and which is worse than smoking or obesity for your physical health. Poor social skills. I think that's related. A lot of men in their 30s, 40s end up being very lonely because they're not able to communicate in a way that is required in a relationship. Substance abuse and mental health issues are also rising in the West. And they're becoming a lot more common and more common, because what's the manly way of dealing with our emotions? We just go for the bottle of whiskey. We go out with friends for a beer, right? So that's going up, and higher suicide rates are also going up, especially in North America, for Caucasian and Native men. So in 2019, where are we at right now in discussing masculinity? I thought this was relevant for folks who were joining the workshop, knowing that you were coming from mostly from administration and sexual violence prevention offices at your schools. White Ribbon recently did an assessment of how men were feeling in the Me Too era, right? We wanted to understand how it was creating conversations, or maybe not creating conversations, right? So we did this through a consultant. They came back to us and told us that it seems like a lot of men are just avoiding the conversation on Me Too. They're afraid to enter the conversation because they might either just use the wrong language and they are afraid of being labeled as sexist, or they are also afraid of just something coming to light of what they have done in the past, right? So they term this as a culture of fear, because men just don't want to engage in this conversation. And it seems like, yeah, conversions are not happening. Their suggestions were that we should create spaces, safe spaces, in which men can discuss this without the fear of being labeled anything, just like openly having that space for men to discuss sexual violence and Me Too. Something that is is also is coming to our attention a lot, is this phenomenon called the manosphere. I spoke about the incel community. They're a community part of what is known as the manosphere, which is an aggregate of online communities that is recognized or is characterized by being using very sexist language, objectifying women, and just having mindsets and attitudes that bring a lot of issues into our communities by enabling, if not actually endorsing, violence against women and the LGBTQ plus community. Now I'm going to pass to talk about sexual violence. If there are any questions about what I just spoke about, please let me know. If not, we can just leave them for the end. I'm going to be giving you just a few facts on sexual violence, and then some tips in how we can address sexual violence in our own campuses by engaging men and boys. So, of course, here's the definition of sexual violence. We work with any sexual act or act targeting an individual's sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression, whether the act is physical or psychological in nature, that is committed, threatened, or attempted against an individual without that individual's consent. So as I said, most men are not violent, but we know that men are responsible for 90 to 99% of cases of sexual assault. We know that 1 in 3 Canadian women are survivors of sexual violence, 1 in 6 men. And we know that your level of vulnerability also depends on the intersecting identities and lived experiences you've gone through, right? Folks of trans experience might be more likely to go through instances of sexual violence, Indigenous and Aboriginal women as well. And something that I think I learned in my work with white women, and which has been getting a lot of my attention lately, is how despite the stereotype of sexual violence, of course, coming from somebody that we don't know, somebody hiding in a dark alley that is ready to attack the person, violence is mostly happening within relationships. Most of the time most of the time it's happening from people that we know. Many times it is happening within relationships. We know dating violence is huge among the age group of 15 to 24, which includes, of course, high school students and university and college students. And I add this image to your right, because I'm just starting to understand how much we need to be talking about what it means to be in a healthy relationship, construct healthy relationships as a way of preventing violence and sexual violence. I added this particular screenshot because I was preparing one time for an engagement with grade 7s. I hadn't worked with that age group in a long while, and I wanted to look for some tips on how to talk to them, 13-year-olds, and I was typing this on Google. This list of suggestions came up, right? And so, with the exception of how to talk to short people, let's ignore that. A lot of the searches that I was getting were related to how to build significant, important relationships with others, right? Which really caught my attention because I think it's a topic that we have to start addressing. Something that I've been bringing up also a lot at Why Ribbon is that we have to start talking about not only what people shouldn't be doing, but also about what people should be doing and how to create healthy, successful relationships of any kind, even if they last a couple hours, even if they last like a lifetime, right? So I brought some data here from a fantastic paper called The Talk, which was produced by Harvard University and another institution, which I cannot recall right now. And just to elaborate on the point I was making, a lot of the knowledge that we get on relationships and sexuality come from media, right? Many of our parents don't talk to us about it. Many schools don't talk about it. So we end up just learning from movies, which can range from these movies to American comedies, which tend to be quite sexist, right? And I brought this data because it just shows how much young people want to have these discussions, and I think we as in gender-based violence prevention work could leverage on this. So we know that 70% of 18 to 25-year-olds wish they had received more information from their parents about some emotional aspect of a romantic or sexual relationship, including how to have a more mature relationship, how to deal with breakups, how to avoid getting hurt in a relationship, and how to begin a relationship. So that being said, that little section on violence happening within relationships and sexual violence, I'm going to finish this webinar, I think in the next probably like 15, 20 minutes, then we can leave some space for questions. Just talking a little bit about 3 things that we can do from our organizations in order to prevent sexual violence. So first of all, it's important to imagine what would be a culture of healthy relationships and consent would look like in our organizations, in our institutions, in our colleges and universities, right? It's not only about having the talk on consent in legal terms, but also about how to have relationships of quality. We know that 28% of Canadians, only 28% of Canadians have a good understanding of what consent means. This might be because the conversation is rapidly changing. This might be because now that all the attention is on Me Too, folks are realizing that they didn't know what consent was. So it's important to just, as I said, not think about consent just as in legal terms. Like you shouldn't be doing this because it might be illegal, but also what are relationships of quality, and how do we leverage on our capacity in institutions, as institutions. And this could be talking about like campus campaigns, social media campaigns that we can just run through our social media outlets to create that discussion that could lead to a culture of healthy relationships and consent. I have this diagram here, which I often use to get folks talking and give them a better understanding of what consent is. Of course, it has to be freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific, and sober. And I'm not going to go through a lot of detail here because I know I'm talking to an audience that knows and works by providing or passing this knowledge to the student body. So I'm going to just focus there a lot, but just ask me, please let me know if there are any questions. But here are a set of questions that I think are a good beginning in how we can tailor our programs or our workshops or our content online to foster that culture of healthy relationships and consent. How is our community talking about women? Are we objectifying them? Are we are men in our varsity teams, talking about women as something that you conquer, or something that you add to your list of sexual encounters. How are we talking about relationships? Are we perpetuating the myth of, or are we in our community perpetuating the myth of the hookup culture, which we now know is not true? Most people are not hooking up. Most millennials and Generation Z are not hooking up. They prefer other kinds of relationships, right? Are we perpetuating that? Are we talking about the things that people should look for in a relationship? How do we choose our friends, and what topics do we speak about with them? How is this question applying to our communities? Is the friendship in groups of males, and especially student leaders, let's say athletes, let's say folks who are part of our unions, of just leading organizations, part of the student body. How are they defining their friendships? Is it based on that measuring of who's more masculine based on that man box that we revised previously? Is it on respect? Is it on supporting each other in a realistic manner? How are we, and how are folks dealing with rejection? That's I think an important topic, because a lot of situations of violence come from situations in which somebody's being rejected. And I think this happens a lot in dating apps, which is something that young people are using a lot in order to meet each other and create relationships and so on. And I didn't include this here, but I want to share an Instagram account which has made me really aware of how big of an issue this is. The account is called Violet Claire, and this is I'm leaving it on the comments, and it's a visual artist who started having a segment in her Instagram account in which she had something, and I think she just recently changed the name, something called screenshots with psychopaths, something like this, right? And she would just share screenshots that were sent by everyone, but she would get mostly submissions from women about mostly men not dealing with rejection on dating platforms very well, and then being very aggressive and violent, right? And it's something to pay attention to, because I think it's not only happening online, it's also happening in person, but we're not having a discussion on how folks deal with rejection. And lastly, what could new scripts about masculinity and relationships look like? And that leads me to the next point, which is positive role modeling. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, we know that men model the behavior of other men. Men are copying that behavior because, as somebody mentioned, there's this phenomenon called gender policing, in which we're just like looking at each other and we measure how it is acceptable to act, let's say, right? So we've found that it's really a good strategy to encourage a positive role modeling from athletes and student leaders, because it's common in university and college campuses that the entire community has their eyes on them because they're looking up to them, they respect them a lot, and so it is really important to get the message across maybe first with them, so that the message can pass to other community members, right? It's important to let athletes know that they have a responsibility as athletes, not only in winning the games, right, but also in showing respect towards like their community and and building that culture of healthy relationships and consent that we spoke about. We have a campaign called It Starts With You. This week on our social media, please look us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We have released a campaign on role modeling. And it's all about getting parents, educators, professors, schools administrations, athletes, to recognize that they have this responsibility and that other men are looking up to them, and that they need to be talking about gender-based violence prevention and how to engage in healthy relationships and construct them. Now, lastly, bystander intervention. I know that probably most colleges and universities across Ontario are already familiar with what bystander intervention is. So I'm not going to take too much time explaining what it is. Of course, it would be a situation in which, or how I usually describe it, is stop thinking about stories or situations in which violence is happening as just having two characters, just the perpetrator or the victim and survivor. But instead thinking of stories or situations of violence as them happening within a network. Folks have friends, family, colleagues that could have at some point said, hey, you know what, like, you just made a sexist comment, that's not good for you, that's not good for the person you're talking about. Just finish it, right? It's not good, right? You see that on this slide, I particularly put his colleagues, his family, because I often share a story with the students about like my personal life, and I'm talking about a specific individual here. So my apologies for that, I didn't change it. Should say colleagues, family, friends, and so on. But we just encourage folks to think about networks and how violence is happening in networks. As I said, many times sexist attitudes and violence can be perceived by community members, and yet we are not doing enough to address them. We just think, that's harmless sexism, right? What we're not recognizing in this kind of situation is that this harmless sexism is enabling violence in our communities. It's creating a space for violence to happen. So we use the 4Ds to talk about bystander intervention. I know different schools and different organizations have different models. Of course, it's important to let students know, community members know, that there are different ways of intervening. You don't always just have to like jump into a situation and directly intervene to prevent a situation of violence. Sometimes distraction could be a good way. Sometimes delegating, which means just calling for support, somebody who has power, somebody who has the capacity to really intervene in the situation is important, right? And we also encourage checking in later. Just if students see a situation of violence, checking in with the person who was victimized and saying, hey, are you okay? Do you want me to make a call? Do you want me to look for support? We like just asking what you can do for them. Of course, always keeping in mind the risk, the multiple scenarios that could happen, and always asking folks to keep in mind their own safety when intervening. Now, going back to what I was just saying a bit ago, it's really important for us as White Ribbon to encourage bystander intervention, thinking about sexual violence as a spectrum, right? As I said, sometimes we think that some forms of sexism are harmless, right? And we just really want to encourage folks to think that a lot of that harmless sexism enables violence, and that's why we want them to intervene as bystanders, not only when they're seeing violence happening, but also when they see these cultural and social norms being alive in our communities, right? So I said, somebody said made a sexist comment, somebody made a sexist joke. Just this morning, I was going through the news and I found an article about a school in the States, I think, in which the boys made a list of ranking the girls based on their looks, their appearance, something like this, right? And for many guys, this would have been just like something harmless. This they would have easily argued, well, this is just not gonna cause any violence. Has no repercussions, right? Luckily, one of the boys did recognize that this is seriously problematic and told one of the girls, and the girls organized and asked the administration to take this event very seriously, right? Most guys were or most boys in that particular class were involved, and it only took one boy to dismantle this way of sexism, right? And you can see how in the long term, in the lives of these boys, just this list could lead them to have more and more sexist attitudes that are going to create harm in their communities against women, the LGBTQ plus community, and also in their lives. As we said, a lot of men are ending up lonely without being able to construct relationships because expectations are unrealistic, because expectations are based on norms that like are very sexist. So I think this leads us to our last slide. Just to finish this webinar and this section before maybe I open it up for questions, if any. We really encourage you to go to our website, sign our pledge, and maybe encourage male-identified folks in your communities to sign the pledge. We encourage you to visit our resources. Jawline Campaign has a website, dtl.whiteribbon.ca. The It Starts With You website, which was listed already above. We have great resources so that you have a better understanding of male engagement, masculinities, and what men can do to give an end to gender-based violence. Accountability is really important always. Encourage folks to take this seriously and pass it on to their communities. Everyone has to know that through accountability we can create better relationships, and through accountability we can come to address the really difficult situations of violence and sexual violence that are happening in our communities. Taking time to question our own attitudes, right? It's not uncommon to always have folks who identify as allies or identify as male feminists, but they don't take the time to think how they're acting in their relationships, right? So I usually just value more actions over the labels that we put on ourselves. I think that's really important. Having these conversations as much as we can. A single conversation can really change somebody's worldview. Especially if you're a male-identified person watching this, just talking to other guys about this, I think will make the life of those around you better, and also your life. I think there is a lot to win from gender equity, and highlighting that is really important. I think that's it for me. I know there was a problem with the link. My colleague Veronique just helped me putting the new link for the pledge right now. My apologies. I think I have to update it on my slides. I hadn't noticed that. that's it. I have this survey that